You remember, we'll give a quick little overview of what's been happening in Ruth chapter 3. As we started Ruth chapter 3, remember that Naomi had called Ruth to her side and said, you go see Boaz, and here's what you're going to do. And what do you remember that Naomi told Ruth? What was the most intriguing thing that you remember Naomi told Ruth? Do what? Go lay at his feet. That's one of the things that's interesting. What's the other one? Go take a bath. Go take a bath and go lay at his feet, and you listen to him, and you pay attention to him. And Ruth, as we enter into verse 5, is consenting to this plan. And remember, we read verse 5 last week where it reads, and she said unto her, all that thou sayest unto me I will do. I want to pick up with this in this particular scene. We need to be a people. Now, I'm saying this to a room in which is on the, and pardon the way I'm going to say this, but just bear with me. I'm saying this to a group of people in this room who are on the Naomi side of things, the advice-giving side. Now, I say that out of respect, but we need to be a people who can give advice to younger generations. What did Ruth need? What did she need? What did she need in her life? In the essence, she needed a husband. She needed to be taken care of as life continued to go on. What happens to us in life? What's the one thing that happens to everybody, and it does not discriminate on any basis? We age. Everybody, do you agree with this? Everybody gets older. You believe that? Yeah. Charlie spent last week with my parents and received the royal treatment, as you would imagine. And he came back and he was a little bit taller and he was a little bit heavier. Life ages every one of us. And as life changes, our situations change. And here Naomi is giving Ruth some information. But at the same time in verse 5, what also do we need in this world? We need our advice-giving Naomis, but we need our listening Ruths, don't we? We need our listening Ruths. Probably one characteristic that describes those that are in the bracket of 25 and below in the world we live is they don't listen, do they? We have a generation of young people who are eating Tide Pods and trying to tell us about our laws. Does anybody disagree with that? I'm not saying that to be funny. It's funny, okay? It's tragic. But that's where our world looks right now. We've turned a generation of people, and I say we, the United States has turned a group of people to where we want our lawmakers to put labels on cleaning products, do not eat this. And yet they skip school to hold rallies to change the laws. What have we done?
A broken down system.
We've created a ruthless system. There's advice given every day. Should be. Now, part of our problem in our country is we failed to give advice to our younger generations. I'm talking about as a country as a whole, not as the Lord's people. I pray that never happens to us. But as a country, we've no longer lived as Naomis, but we've lived as enablers. Because if anybody wants it, what does our country tell them? Go get it. If anybody desires it, what does our country tell them? That's okay. If it's wrong, what does our country tell? What does our country say? It's okay. We've created a system which enables any behavior, but what's happening here in verse 1 through 5? Naomi says you need to think about your life and you need to think about your longevity because life is getting short and you're not getting any younger.
Ruth was very obedient.
Yes, she was. Yes, she was.
All that you have said, I will.
Yes, I love that phrase in verse 5. Not just some of it. Most people would get trapped up, I'm not laying at his feet. Now, we're just being specific with what's happening here, but most people say, I'm not, I'll take a bath, but I'm not doing the rest. I love the scenes here. All that you say I will do. And enter with me into verse 6. Let's keep making this application. Wait, pause before you hit to verse 6. We've made the application to our nation from verse 5. We need Naomi's and Ruth's. What about in the Lord's church? Do we need Naomi's advice givers? Do we need Ruth's advice takers? Yeah. Remember, it's a two-way street. It's a two-way street. Ruth and Naomi both had to carry this out. So verse 6, it begins, and she went down into the floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law bade her. And when Boaz has eaten and drank and his heart was merry, he went down to lie at the end of the heap of corn, and she came softly and uncovered his feet and laid down. Now pick up with me in verse 8. Let's read it down just a little bit longer. And it came to pass at midnight that the man was afraid and turned himself, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. And he said, Who art thou? And she answered, I am Ruth, thy handmaid. Spread therefore thy skirt over my handmaid, for thou art a near kinsman. Now pause for a minute. What are we learning about Boaz? Got to use your thinking caps on this one. What are we learning about Boaz? Well, number one, he's a good man. Why is he a good man? Yes, sir. You're right. He's a good man, but what are we learning right here, especially in verses 8 and 9? He's respectable. I heard something over here. Respectful and respectable. Okay, I'm going to ask you another question. Why? Why do we say that? He's a moral man. Okay, now let me explain something to you. Let's set the scenes. Man wakes up, and at the end of his bed is a woman. What was the reaction of Boaz? He was afraid. What's the reaction of modern day man? Exact opposite. You're right. You're right. We're learning something about Boaz. Not only was he a man who handled his employees correctly, not only was he a man who respected God as he needed to, but he was a man who had boundaries on his life. I think this shows us this. He was a man who had boundaries on his life. He wakes up here, and I love the scenes of this. He wakes up in the corn, and there was a boundary that he had placed on his life. He knew this was not normal. This was different. At midnight, he woke up, and here she was. Now the word skirt in verses 8 and 9 is a word that means wing. When we read that in the English, it almost makes it sound like she's saying, uncover thyself. But she's saying, spread your wing of protection over me. So that's what she's saying. She's coming with these motives. Spread your wing of protection. Spread your wing of care over me. And that's what she requests of him. Now, Boaz is going to pick up in this particular scene, especially as you pick up in verse 10 in this area. Read verse 10 and 11, chapter 3, 10 and 11. And he said, Boaz, blessed be thou of the Lord, my daughter, for thou hast shown me more kindness in the latter end than at the beginning, inasmuch as thou followest not young men, neither poor or rich. And now, my daughter, fear not, I will do to thee all that thou requirest, for all the city of my people doth know that thou art a virtuous woman. What are we learning about Ruth? Boaz had morals. Ruth had what was specifically used? Virtue. Now, who knew that Ruth was a virtuous woman? Who knew? Whole city. Now, hang on a minute. Let's go back to Ruth's situation. Where was Ruth from? Moab. Where's she at now? Jerusalem. What does that make her? An immigrant. And yet the whole community knows. What about Ruth? She has virtue. She's a virtuous woman. There's a lot wrapped up in that word, isn't there? When you look at this particular scene, you start to see who she was. She was an industrious woman, wasn't she? She was willing to put the work in, wasn't she? She went into the field and she told Naomi, "You stay and I will go." And for the whole reaping season, where was Ruth? In the fields gleaning. Through two different types of harvest, remember, the corn and the barley. She was a woman of instruction. She listened to Naomi, didn't she? Part of being a virtuous woman is not just being industrious, but it's taking in wisdom from others. You go read Proverbs 31, the virtuous woman, same scene's being said. She,
When she uncovered Boaz's feet, she was saying that making a marriage proposal.
yes, she was bold. She was. She was. In all of these scenes, this is who she was.
Jonathan, they were also not afraid of work. What they were doing is
Hard work.
back-breaking work that they were doing just to subside.
Yes. And remember, for Ruth, this is her survival. This wasn't about making money for Ruth. This was about surviving.
When it says she went softly, that meant she went secretly because she did not want to embarrass.
Yes. Yeah. She was the epitome of Proverbs 31. Now, a little side note about Proverbs 31. Next time you read it, notice carefully in Proverbs 31 the first 5 or 6 verses, and notice where that advice comes from. Does anybody know where the advice in Proverbs 31 comes from? It was written to a king. Does anybody know who wrote it to him? Where the advice came from? His mother. His mother. Isn't that interesting? Proverbs 31. His mother writes to him about that. Just a side note, had nothing to do with our class, just a tidbit I learned in the past little bit. So here she is, and here all of this is happening. And verse 11 is very impressive to me. For all the city of my people doth know that thou art a virtuous woman. So what is he saying? I also know, Ruth, who you are. Now in this particular scene, Ruth has listened to the advice of Naomi. Naomi has given good advice. She has been gentle or secretive or kind to Boaz, and Boaz has treated her kindly. But what do we know about Ruth extra? There's something else here about Ruth we need to notice. To be all of the things that she has been called, what does she have to do? To be a virtuous woman, who do you have to be first? Who do you have to be first to be a virtuous woman? Yeah, a godly woman. Same thing for a man. If a man wants to follow the virtues in Scripture, what does he have to be? He's got to be a godly man. So we're seeing the impression in this particular scene of what it means to be, and I'm going to use this word and very carefully, what it means to be religious. Is being religious just something that you do? I'm going to use these 2 days just as general days on Sunday and Wednesday. Is that what being religious means? No. It's more than that, isn't it? Christianity is more than attendance, isn't it? Yeah. It's every day. It's in our actions. It's in how, and I'll suggest to us from the book of Ruth, it's in how we're known by our community. Think about this. Does the community even know who we are? I hope so. Now answer this question. What does the community think about us? Would they say, such as Boaz said about Ruth, the community knows you and you are a godly people? That's essentially, in essence, what Boaz is telling her. Is that what the community would say? Yes, exactly. Exactly. And here she's being depicted. That's who she was. Now pick up with me in 12 and 13. 12 and 13. It reads this way, and now it is true that I am thy near kinsman, howbeit there is no kinsman nearer than I. Tarry this night, and it shall be in the morning, that if he will perform unto thee the part of a kinsman, well, let him do the kinsman part, but if he will not depart of a kinsman to thee, then will I do the part of a kinsman to thee, as the Lord liveth, lie down until the morning. Boaz states something here. And it's an affirmation of fact. The idea of kinsmanship has with it, or has inside of it, the idea of a succession. In other words, there was an order to this. There was a mandated order to this, and Boaz says there's one closer than I. But if he will not, I will do. What is Boaz showing us about himself? I think Boaz has already showed us that he has showed his kind favor to Ruth, didn't he? I think Boaz has already showed his care that he has shown to Ruth, didn't he? I think Boaz has shown that he sees qualities in Ruth that are worth something, and that he even himself has boundaries on the way he lives his life, and that's important to see. But he's showing us something else here in verses 12 through 13, and Ruth's going to show us the same thing. They're going to respect God's law. They're going to respect God's law. Now, in our world, let me just ask this simple, plain question of our country. Do we respect God's law?
I don't think so, not in this day and age. And our government's way of thinking and doing things,
Anybody disagree? Yeah. And that's the reality of this. There were going to be people in the city in which they lived who did not respect God's law. That's not a guaranteed fact, but let's be honest. Do all Christians respect God's law? They should. But do they? No. No. Same thing is true in the day of Boaz. The people of God, how many times in the Old Testament do we read of the people of God living after themselves and turning away from God? It was a lack of respect of God's law. It was a lack of respect of God's authority. What does Boaz show us? He took the time to survey the situation and say, let's do this right. What a quality. And Ruth is going to fall in line with this, because when you pick up in verse 14, look at what she's done. He says, lay here through the night. Verse 14, she lay at his feet until the morning, and she rose up before one could know another, and he said, let it not be known that a woman came into the floor. Boaz told Ruth to stay where she was, and in the morning, until the morning, he said, go early so no one will see you. What's Boaz teaching her here? Don't leave bad impressions. Don't leave bad impressions. She was to reign until early in the morning before it got light enough to see and recognize anyone. Verse 15, and he said, bring the veil that thou hast upon thee and hold it. And when she held it, he measured 6 measures of barley and laid it on her, and she went into the city. What is he doing again for Ruth? He's taking care of her. Now, who's paying for all of this that he's giving her? He is. He is. Also in verse 15, we learn something about Boaz, and it's something we can apply to our lives. Sometimes we have to give without expecting anything in return. I think we've lost that principle to a degree as Christians. We want to require. We want to conditionally give, but we shouldn't. Verse 16, and when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, who art thou, my daughter? And she told her all that the man had done unto her. He tells her everything that had happened, or she tells her, back to Naomi, everything that had happened. Now look at verse 17, and she said, these 6 measures of barley he gave me, and he said, go not empty unto thy mother-in-law. Who else is Boaz concerned about? Naomi. Who did he have interactions with? Ruth. Why is he worried about Naomi? Kinfolks. I think that has a lot to do with it right there. Yes, I think the kinfolk has something to do with it too, but what's Ruth doing? She's taking care of Naomi. Boaz knew the situation of Ruth. Simple question here. Do we know the situation of those in need of our community? A lot happening in this particular scene. A lot happening in this particular book. And I love verse 18 as chapter 3 begins to close itself out. Then she said, this is Naomi to Ruth again, "Sit still, my daughter, until thou knowest how the matter will fall, for the man will not be in rest until he have finished the thing this day." What does Naomi think of Boaz? Evidently, she thinks a lot of him because she knows that he's going to take care of what he has told Ruth. And I love what she says. He'll take care of it today. I think there's an implication there for us that there are things that we must take care of today. Today. And here Boaz is going to be doing this. Naomi perceives the goodness of Boaz, and I love what she says to Ruth. Sit in quietness. Why'd you tell her to sit in quietness? Have you ever had to deal with anticipation? How'd that work out for you? How'd that work out for you? We sometimes say, don't be a nervous Nancy. That's the idea here. Sit in your quietness. Don't worry about it. Just sit in the quietness. Sit in the calmness of the day, because at the end of the day, it's going to work out. That's the advice that Naomi is giving. And I love what he says, for the man will not rest until she or he has finished this thing this day. Naomi continues to tell Ruth and give Ruth great advice so that she could continue to go after the thing that she needed. Now, yes. I think he wanted to follow the law as tightly and good as he could. I do too. I think he could have. But it shows us the scenes of respecting God. In this life, we make decisions every day. Just as Boaz here, and Ruth and Naomi and everyone that's involved in this, they're making decisions. Who was their priority? God was their priority. Who were they there to? Who was going to give them approval? God was going to give them approval by them following God's law. Where were they going to find happiness? Our world searches for happiness, doesn't it? Sometimes it's all about what we hear about, isn't it? Happiness, desire. Our world spends a lot of time in that realm. Where does Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz find happiness? This book is a God-centered book because you have three gigantic main characters or individuals who actually lived on this earth, and God was their priority. They were still, remember, we're still talking about Old Testament times, so we're not talking about the New Testament. Matter of fact, in their minds, the New Testament is not even, I would suggest, a little twinkling, is it? They're concerned about God's law, the Old Testament, and that's why earlier in the prayer I sort of mentioned Romans 15:4. Whatsoever things written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of Scripture might have hope. What hope did Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz have? Following after God. That's hope. What hope do we have? Has the hope changed? No, we're still following after God. Every day we're making decisions, but here's the question we ask as we round chapter 3 out. Are we Boaz-like in the fact that we want to do it God's way? Don't we oftentimes want to do it our way? Are we Naomi-like in the fact that we see someone in which we can influence? Now listen to how she did it. She did it with kindness and care. There's a difference between a dictator and a mentor. Naomi was a mentor. And then there's Ruth. She listened to both Naomi, Boaz, but more importantly, in the triangle we're creating with Ruth, who else did she listen to? God. That's the scenes of what's happening in this book as chapter 3 comes to a close. And chapter 4 is a new day because they're going to meet at the gate. They're going to meet at the gate. And we'll explain this as we go. Read verse 1 and verse 2 with me. Then went Boaz up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the kinsman of whom Boaz spake came by. And he said, Hold, such a one, turn aside and sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down, verse 2. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, Sit down here, and they sat down. What's happening right now? Why are they at the gate? What was the gate? What was the gate? Exactly. It was a business center. It was a study center. It was a community area for decisions. And the wise of the community would sit down at the gate. You read this oftentimes in Old Testaments. They went to the gate. They sat down at the gate. That's what's happening here. That's right. Even the king would go to the gate for advice. You're right. They sat down here at a place for decision. That's the gate, a place for wise decision. And verses 3 and 4, Boaz is going to make known the problem. And he said unto the kinsman, Naomi, that is come out of the country of Moab, selleth a parcel of land which is our brother's Elimelech's. And I go to advise thee, saying, Buy it before the inhabitants and before the elders of my people. If thou wilt redeem it, redeem it. But if thou wilt not redeem it, then tell me, that I may know, for there is none to redeem it besides thee, and I am after thee. And he said, I will redeem it. In the presence of witnesses, Boaz invites this kinsman to ask him what he's going to do. And Boaz, it is evident, had talked with Ruth the entire details of this plan, and thus he could speak sort of authoritatively on what was going to happen. Naomi, we suppose, must have previously taken Ruth's full confidence so that Boaz could learn secondhand the circumstances that were happening in the situation. Look at verse 5. Then Boaz, what day thou buyest the field of the hand of Naomi, thou must also buy it, or buy of Ruth the Moabite, the wife of the dead, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance. What is Boaz trying to tell this other kinsman? All the details. I think this is something that's important here that we can apply to our lives. You know, when we bring people into our lives, whether it be in friendships or marriage or other aspects of life, we need to let them know the details. We need to let them know the details, now listen to this, of our lives.
There were frequent things required of a kinsman, redeemer, or goel.
Go, yeah. Mm-hmm.
He had to be related to the one that was to be redeemed. He had to be able to pay the price of redemption, and he must be willing to redeem.
Mm-hmm.
That kinsman fulfilled the first two, but he wouldn't fulfill the third.
He was unwilling. But I love Boaz here. He sets the table. He sets the scene. Here is what you must do. It's interesting in this particular section, verses 1 through 4. 1 and 2, he brings the counsel. 3 and 4, he tells them, this is what you've got to do. You've got to, will you redeem it? I'll redeem it. Verse 5, here's the details. Make sure you're going to do this before you say it. Are you going to go through with all of this? And verse 6 settles it here after verse 5. And the kinsman said, I cannot redeem it. I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I mar my own inheritance. Redeem thou my right to thyself, for I cannot redeem it. The kinsman now is reversing his decision, declining the offer to redeem the land. He would lose the money he would pay for the redemption land, for it would become the property of the sons of Ruth. Also, there would be an extra burden on this man of this family.
Well, also, any children they had would be the sons of Elimelech. And
Yes,
not
they would be.
kinsmen.
And also, in the scenes of that, they would be the sons or daughters of a idolatrous nation, wouldn't they? Where was Ruth from? Moab. And that would also be probably in his mind. So he declines to exercise his right to redeem this land. Now, what's his name? Good answer. It doesn't give it. Sometimes there are little details that we may want to know, but we just do not have that information. Was not extremely crucial to the account. So in verse 7 and 8, here it continues on. Now this was the manner in the former time of Israel concerning redeeming and concerning changing. For to confirm all things, a man plucked off his shoes and gave it to his neighbor. And this was a testimony in Israel. Therefore the kinsman said unto Boaz, buy it for thee. So he drew off his shoes. That was an important part, wasn't it? It really was.
That's like today, signing a document or handing over the keys.
That's right. That's right.
It also meant that the person that put on that shoe had the right to walk on that land that was being redeemed.
That's right. There's rights on every side of the term, and the coin isn't there. So this was an expression that was good. You know, no doubt the shoe, after being received, was a sign of goodwill, a sign of good faith, and a sign of agreement. Now, verses 9 and 10, Boaz said unto the elders, now notice this, where are they still at? In the gate. They're still at the place of decision. So now Boaz turns to the elders, the wise counsel here, and notice this, and unto all the people. By this time, a crowd seems to have drawn around. So Boaz is not only addressing the council, the elders, but also the people, and he says, you are my witness this day, that I have bought all that was Elimelech's and all that was Chilon's and Malion's at the hand of Naomi. Moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of Malion, have I purchased to be my wife, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance, that the name of the dead be not cut off from among his brethren and from the gate of his people. Ye are a witness this day. Boaz stated something very important. Very important. In the crucial things of life, we need to rely on others to hold us accountable. In the crucial things of life, we must rely on others to hold us accountable. He turns to the elders, the wise counsel. He turns to the people that have drawn near, and what does he say? Hold me accountable. But he also says this, do not forget the dead. Do not forget history. Do not forget God's law. It's what he is declaring to these people.
The concept of kinsman or redeemer is an important portrayal of the work of Christ.
It is. It is. All of this has a meaning. All of this has a purpose. But in this, from verse 9 and 10 down to verse 11 and 12, which we'll read in just a minute, there's something happening. Boaz calls on all the people that were there, hold me accountable. Do the people and does the council have any requirements on that either? Look at verse 11 and 12. And all the people that were in the gate and the elders said, we are witness. Now listen to this. The Lord, who did the wise counsel start everything with? It wasn't the world. It was the Lord. Now, unfortunately, the bell just gave its little ring. That means we have 3 minutes in this particular section, so that's going to work out very well for us as we think about this particular section. So what you need to do as you prepare for next week's class is you'll need to read the rest of the book of Ruth. There's not much left in space of time. You're just going down from verse 11 down to verse 23. So not a lot happening there. There's also going to be some genealogy at the end of that particular section. But here's what I want to end the class with. Boaz said, "You hold me accountable, every one of you." And every one of them said, "So will the Lord." Don't miss that. In the weighty things of life, don't miss that. Now, I'm not saying when you tell someone you'll go pick up their dry cleaner, may the Lord hold you accountable. That's not what we're saying in this particular scene. But there are requirements that the Lord should hold us accountable for, isn't there? There's the requirement of marriage in which we should be held accountable for, isn't there? There's the requirement of Christian living, and by that I mean Christian and Christian association. We should require of each other to do as the Lord commanded, and we should ask each other to hold us accountable. Thus, when you get into the New Testament, you see the scenes of those things taking place. And we must also, inside of what's happening here at this conclusion section of the book of Ruth, which will finish next week, we must depend on the Lord. That's why I love to study the Old Testament. You will get this theme in every book that exists. We've got to depend on the Lord. We're going to make mistakes. Hear me clearly. We're not perfect, but we must depend on the Lord. That's where we'll end today. We'll pick up next week. So read the rest of this chapter, and we'll finish this book out, and we'll start also introducing the book of Esther next week and clear these two things together. Thank you so much.